All right, advisors. So, one of the biggest decisions that we face is whether or not we should start our own RIA. And my guest today is Brad Wales. He is the founder of Transition to RIA, and he's helped hundreds of advisors navigate that transition over a 20-year career. Is that right? 20 years about?
Yeah, coming up on 25 soon. I like to round up to a nice
Yeah.
nice number. So yeah, I'm at that point.
Yeah. So today we're going to go over the biggest factors to consider and see really just see what makes the most sense for you if you're evaluating this big decision. So Brad, let's jump right in. You talk to a lot of advisors every day who are uh, maybe they're frustrated with their current situation. But what are the biggest pain points that actually drive someone to actually pick up the phone and give you a call?
Yeah, and thanks, Dave, for having me on. Appreciate all you do for the industry. 350 plus videos I think you've put out there. So fantastic, and appreciate you letting me be a part of it here. So yeah, I do have the luxury, not that I'm smarter than the next guy by any means, but just by hearing the kind of feedback over and over from so many different kinds of advisors, so many different kinds of teams. I'm kind of a central source of that information, and typically if they don't bring it up on their own, I always start by asking, hey, what has motivated you to reach out? And if they are reaching out, they've probably been thinking about it for some period of time already, and then it's reached the point they now want to chat. And so no matter how that's expressed, and it is expressed in multiple different ways, the frustrations or the motivations, but it typically falls into one or two buckets, often both, and that's flexibility and economics, and we'll probably kind of get into both of those. But typically, folks start with things that I would put in the flexibility bucket, and I don't know if that's because no one wants to come out and immediately say I want to make a higher income. That is relevant. But usually it's a frustration on the flexibility side. And of course, the economics are always nice where that might line up as well.
Okay. If you're a financial advisor trying to grow your practice over the next 5 years, what got you here won't get you there because the industry is changing fast, right? AI, fee compression, shifting client expectations. This isn't 2015 anymore. And that's why we created the Future of Advice Academy. It's a training platform led by me and Ron Bullis, packed with the exact playbooks and the tools and frameworks we're using right now to grow fast, from marketing and sales to client service and long-term strategy. This is the stuff that's working for us today. We also get on live training calls every month to help you along your journey in growing your business. So if you're serious about building a future-proof firm, check it out at futureofadvice.com, and there's a link below the video. So when it comes to real numbers, I know you mentioned that advisors believe they're making a certain payout, but the reality might be a little bit different. Can you kind of walk through what advisors are actually making versus what they think they're making?
Yeah, it's a great question in this because I talk to so many different types of advisors and affiliation models that the answer can go in several different ways. So that wirehouse advisor that has that kind of more traditional grid and everything is generally paid for them, and then they receive some sort of payout, or that 1099 independent broker dealer advisor that has a payout, but then there's often perhaps platform fees or even custody fees or however it's positioned. And so it's expressed in several different ways. And I do talk to folks at times that say, particularly if they're an independent broker dealer, and they say, oh, I'm getting a 93% payout or some seemingly kind of high number. And that's technically what the so-called payout is in the equation. But it turns out there might be a 25 basis point platform fee. And then I hear, say, oh, well, the client pays that. Well, that's true. The client pays the advisor fee as well. But at the end of the day, a client doesn't care who gets what behind the scenes. They just care, how much am I going to pay in total and what value do I get in return for that? So I always, encourage advisors to say, okay, how much is the client paying in total? And then how much actually flows to you? And the part that doesn't flow to you is you paying that to your firm for the value and services they're providing you. And out of fairness, these firms do provide things for their advisors. The question is, if you put that in dollar terms on an annual basis, are you getting enough value and services for essentially what you're paying your firm to help support your practice?
Okay. So that's just something, how does someone go about actually doing that calculation and figure out what the true number is?
So the simplest, it's usually easier on the wirehouse side than the independent broker dealer, because again, there's usually these kind of auxiliary fees. So take a wirehouse advisor, super simple numbers. Let's say they have a 40% payout, but even then it's tricky because usually some of that is then deferred comp. And folks say, well, yeah, but I'll get that. But you're essentially handcuffed until and if you retire at your firm one day. But we'll even set that aside, but you ultimately need to factor that in. So if you have that 40% payout, that means you're paying 60% of the house. And so if you are easy numbers, an advisor producing $1 million in fees and commissions, and you're getting a payout of 40%, obviously your firm's keeping 60, that's $600,000. And so what you just have to ask yourself is, am I getting $600,000 worth of value? And again, you're absolutely getting value. You're probably getting an office, you're probably getting a team member, you're getting technology, other types of support. The question you want to ask yourself is it, if you instead, as I tell advisors, you mentally think that 100% of the fee comes to you and actually goes in your pocket, and you now need to turn around once a year and to your firm and write them a check for what they provide for you. And if you're writing a check for $600,000, that will make you think it through a little more deeply of, am I getting enough in return for that? But that's, of course, not how it's expressed. It's expressed the inverse, which is the payout. So it's just an exercise that's worth doing. And that's not to suggest that anyone's getting ripped off by their firm or whatnot. The question is it good value, or could you perhaps do it better yourself?
Okay. Have you found it harder for advisors who are, say they're with a broker-dealer and they are getting a 90 or 93% payout? Is it harder for them to make the switch compared to Wirehouse if you're getting a 40% or 50% payout? Is it that clear?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I wouldn't necessarily use the word harder. I think you're implying are the economics not as much of a no-brainer as they are perhaps with a wirehouse advisor, and that is accurate. So to be fair, if you are at a independent broker dealer with a pretty competitive payout, and I know there's the other fees like I talked about, this is not going to be a massive uptick for you on a current day economics to go into your own RIA, because yes, you will now receive 100% of your fees if you start your own RIA, but you will also have costs that, again, your current firm's providing for you that you will need to cover. So the economics are generally better, but it's not nearly as significant as moving up from that wirehouse to RIA space. But on a longer term basis, there's an argument to be had that the economics are better, both in the value, your enterprise value of your firm, and your potential buyer pool one day when you go to sell your practice, your ability to grow your practice faster, which will lead to economics. But as far as the day one comparison, yet to be fair, it's not a massive uptick from an independent broker dealer side. Those folks are primarily doing it more for the flexibility front and the long-term economics.
Okay. You ever see it trend down for a period of time before you get back to break even for those ones that are, again, the higher payout?
Yeah, there's always, you got to factor in your essential startup costs. The nice thing in the RIA world, it's not like opening a restaurant where you got to come up with $1 million maybe minimum just to turn the lights on. The startup costs of an RIA on the front end are relatively reasonable. Most costs are on a going forward basis. But one of the costs, to your question, is there is a lull in revenue, right? So you are turning the spigot off of revenue of where you are now, and likely potentially having to move the assets. And so there is kind of a temporary stoppage of revenue, yet your expenses are still going. So you do want to kind of mentally factor that in as an expense. And then of course, the goal, of course, is to make that up and then be better off going forward.
Yeah. Okay. I know you've mentioned 3 paths to the RIA model. Can you kind of break down those 3 for the advisors listening, and who what might be best suited for each one of those different options we've got?
Yep. So that's how I always frame it, is that at a generic level, before you even worry about particular solution providers or firms, is just to understand the 3, which I'll go through. But from experience, I would tell you, when advisors and teams reach out to me, they often have one of the 3 in mind and perhaps aren't aware of all 3 of them. And I always say, okay, great. Let's at least understand all 3. The one you think initially is the one for you might ultimately be the right one, but let's understand how they all work and how they're different. And I certainly have seen it shift where someone's initial impression, they've learned about something different and realized that was the better path. So it just behooves you to understand how all 3 work. So at a high level, on one end of that spectrum, if you will, is to start your own RIA. And like any RIA, then you need to build out the solution providers around it. So that's things like a custodian and compliance and technology. And by the way, there's pros and cons to all 3 of these. There is no golden goose here. The important thing is to understand how they work and what those pros and cons are. So on one end is you start your own RIA, you build out everything. On the other end is to essentially join an RIA. And I would tell you that probably has the most misconception in the marketplace, because there are all kinds of flavors of RIAs out there that you could, in theory, join with all different kinds of value propositions. And so sometimes I'll hear as I'm walking someone through this, and an advisor will kind of respond back and be like, if I point out that, hey, one option is you join an RIA, and they say, well, yeah, but I don't want to sell my practice yet. Okay, well, that is a flavor, and there are some wonderful solutions out there that depends on where you are in your career that might be favorable right now. But there are plenty of other good flavors that do not at all require that, that say, hey, you are going to retain 100% ownership. You're going to be able to use your own brand. You're going to be 1099 and run your local P&L. Hey, we're just kind of your infrastructure partner behind the scenes. And there's, again, pros and cons to all of those different flavors. So just what I would point out on that is don't come into this thought process with a preconception of what joining an RIA is, because again, there's several different flavors of that. And then in the middle, and I kind of did this in this order on purpose, is there's some solution providers, and there's not as many in this space that say, hey, if you need or want your own RIA, but you just as well not have to piece together, perhaps the 10 or so different solution providers you will need. Hey, we've bundled up about 80% of that. We've done the legwork. We've got more scale to get better pricing with these providers. So we've bundled it all up, and we're kind of a single provider for about 80% of what you need. And again, that kind of fits in the middle. So at a high level, those are the three kind of main options.
Okay. It sounds like if you're doing number two, is that just, I know it's not this, but it kind of feels like if we were at a broker dealer and we were to choose option number two, it sounds like we're going to the same thing we were just leaving in terms of flexibility. No, am I looking at it the wrong way?
And when you say you two, you're talking about in the order that I expressed them of joining an RIA?
Yeah, joining an RIA or hopping onto what do you call the number two option where you're not?
Yeah, there's no official regulatory term. You'll often hear supported independence is kind of that middle ground. Now that's also used in the platforms you can fully join under their ADV. So you always got to be careful when you hear kind of the jargon in the industry. But I think what you're asking is, hey, if I were to join under another RIA platform, is that really giving me a whole lot more flexibility than I have now? And that's a fair argument. There's some arguments out there because some of these solution providers are getting so big that the argument is, well, aren't they just another behemoth like any of these other firms that someone's trying to get away from? And I think as some of those very large firms continue to grow, that is something they're going to have to be able to prove to advisors and teams that they're not going to go down that path. But there are other solutions, and this is very wise on their part, in my opinion, that are more selective of maybe the size of advisor that they're willing to work with, or they are catering to a certain kind of advisor that maybe is coming from a wirehouse background. And so they are not thousands of advisors deep. And so they have often referred to, compliance is managed to the lowest common denominator. Well, if you have 20,000 plus advisors, that's a lot of folks in the denominator. If you measure it in the hundreds of advisors, it's easier to be more flexible in that sort of regard. But the devil's in the details. You have to dig into, what do I want to do with my practice, both from a service offering standpoint, a marketing and branding standpoint, an investment solution standpoint. And if you're looking at a potential RA platform to join, you got to say, here's everything I plan on doing. If you can make my life easier by doing the back office stuff and still let me do all this, that's worth my consideration. If you tell me I can't do this, back to your point of, okay, am I getting more flexibility, and depends on your circumstances, that might push you back more towards having your own RIA.
Okay. Does the factor of responsibility come into play when you're thinking of RIA, your own RIA versus joining one, in terms of compliance, or in terms of, the increasing cybersecurity, like having to get more, like I hear a lot of advisors kind of get freaked out about where cyber threats are going these days with AI and everything like that. Does that, when you're talking to advisors, does that come into play, the whole responsibility piece and just the legal side of it?
It absolutely does. And as I say, there's no golden goose. So per our last question, okay, there's more flexibility with your own RIA, and that's absolutely correct. But to your question now, as I point out to folks, that also comes with the most responsibilities in return for it. So yes, you have more flexibility, but you are responsible for your compliance, responsible for putting the tech stack together, responsible for your cybersecurity. That's all entirely doable. Now, 20 years ago, it was much more difficult because the industry's evolved so much. There's wonderful solution providers that help you with each of those buckets, and you just need to know who are the vendors out there and why you might choose one over the other. But make no mistake, that is still, for many advisors, particularly if you're at a wirehouse, that is a new responsibility. So even if you're leaning on some great solution providers to help you manage it, that is something new that you have. And so you have to weigh, okay, what are the advantages that I will gain from doing this? And And then for me as an individual advisor or team, does that outweigh the additional responsibilities? And that's sometimes what pushes some advisors back to more some of these supported type platforms where they say, hey, I do want some of the better economics. I do want, the higher enterprise value I can have eventually. But to the degree someone else can do the cybersecurity for me, because one, maybe I'm not passionate about that, or I don't desire to try to figure that out, or that intimidates me. Or by the way, I don't want to do the client fee bill and I'd rather have someone else do that. That's where you start to see folks say, okay, well, let me understand what some of these other options are. And if I still have the needed flexibility I want, maybe that's worth, essentially outsourcing to them to handle some of those things instead of you being responsible for them yourself.
Okay. Staying on this topic of the three options, are there any, what about when it comes to AUM and just level of AUM? Do you see people under 100 million going a certain way? Do you see people over 500 or a billion going a certain way in terms of own RIA or hopping on with somebody else?
Yeah, and my job would be easier if it was kind of a simple math equation.
I'm throwing every question at you.
No. It's a great question, I'll start with a rant that I rant about this often. In my opinion, that if there's anyone that you ask that question to and they give you an immediate answer, there's usually an agenda behind that answer. So if you have 150 million, there's plenty of people out there, and client asks, there's plenty of people out there that'll tell you, oh, you shouldn't have your own RIA. And again, there's pros and cons to it. There's certain challenges as well. But oftentimes that voice that might be saying that is some sort of existing RIA platform that's in the business of you having joining their RIA versus you starting their own. So of course they're going to be quick to say, oh, you're not big enough to have your own. I actually heard one a while back, which I think is preposterous, that said, unless you have a billion with a B, you have no business running your own RIA. You should only join one under that amount. And clearly that was biased. I won't name who it was.
Join one under you. If you have a billion or more, join one that's under a billion.
That's what this individual that's at an RIA that's in the business of trying to attract advisors suggested, that wow, if you don't have a billion, again with a B, you're too small to have your own RIA. But again, it was biased feedback because they're in the business of trying to have people join theirs. And so I just always cautious, someone that's quick to answer that. Now, and for perspective too, there's 30,000-ish RIAs out there. About half of that amount are state registered, meaning they're typically the differentiator there is under 100 million, and about 15,000 over 100 million that are in the SEC bucket. So there are absolutely RIAs of all sizes. Now that said, there is some truth to the matter of it is a scale game when you have your own RIA. So the cost of managing the compliance at 100 million in assets, 200 million, maybe 300 million, doesn't necessarily change a whole bunch. Now, as your practice gets even larger and more complicated, there's some additional costs. So it is fair to say, okay, hey, what size does that math really start to gel and really start to work? And there's no magic number. A lot of folks like throwing out the 100 million because that makes you SEC registered, and maybe that's a good starting point. And oftentimes it is, but I can tell you from experience, there's absolutely people under 100 million that, for the right motivations and with a fully informed decision of what the responsibilities are and the trade-offs are, they end up starting their own RIA as well. So long-winded way of saying it's entirely across the board. It just has to make sense for your particular practice.
Okay. What about, so one of the fears is making this jump, whatever one of the three options you choose, and the fear is, are my clients going to follow me? What do you typically see in terms of retention rates with advisors if you have that data?
Yeah, and there's some good surveys out there that usually put it in the 90% plus range. From my almost 25 years of experience in a couple different channels and seeing advisor movement and that's hundreds and hundreds, if not probably over 1,000 when I add it all up. I always say, if you've taken the time to go through this entire discovery due diligence process of exploring your options of a new path, if you've taken the entire time to figure out which of the three options and who are the solution providers and which RIA should I join if that's the path you're going to go on, and if you put that much thought to this exercise and then plan out the whole transition, which is, again, not a rushed exercise. We'll probably talk about kind of how long this typically all takes. I could not tell you a time where someone has done all of that legwork and done it correctly, so this wasn't a fire drill. And by the way, there's one kind of meaningful exception or two I'll add to this, but that has done all that and just grossly miscalculated their client loyalty. And instead of 90% plus, they got 40% and it blew everything up. I do not recall my entire career an instance where, again, all that was done and that went sideways. The exceptions, though, are things clearly if an advisor's been terminated, all bets are off, and it's this fire drill, and you get what you get. I hate to say it that way, but that's an exception. And then there are some scenarios, such as if you are in a bank setting, and realistically, and you got to do some soul searching. Hey, are most of my clients? They are my clients, but most of them came from the bank. They were with the bank before I got here into this setting. They are very loyal to the bank. That's not going to be 90%, or higher. Or if you are, kind of been handed clients perhaps over time more as a junior advisor, but the allegiance, the loyalty is to more of a senior advisor, you need to be true to yourself and say, okay, who are these clients loyal to? But if you've gone out there and done the hard work and prospected and earned your clients one at a time, and you've been with them for years, again, it's hard to screw that up. But that is, in almost every instance, there's still a level of anxiety about that. And I can't tell you the amount of times, and I tell people, I will remind you about this, that 3 months or so, 4 months after the transition, when the dust is settled, and I always hear like, oh, I was way more worried about that than I ever needed to be, or way more anxious. But of course, it's easier to say that after you've actually seen it through and it's worked out.
Before we get to kind of the timeline and what to expect, what are just some other, you mentioned kind of some myths or things that people will put out there, and there's an agenda behind it. Any other myths or any other big mistakes advisors make as they're exploring this or as they're implementing the plan?
Yeah, and I think, and not to be self-serving as, oh, the RA expert, come let me educate you, but there is a lot of misinformation out there, and I think some of it is malicious and some of it is just ill-informed. So there are wirehouse advisors, for instance, that's the only world they've ever known. And for instance, their branch manager literally has an economic interest in them not leaving. And they will plant a message that, oh, if you were to go start your own RA, the SEC is going to eat you alive. And they're going to come in and you're not going to be able to handle all that compliance. And do you really want to deal with that breathing down your neck? And I don't know, again, there's an incentive for them to maybe say that message. And then oftentimes that branch manager themselves has only ever been in that particular channel. So they don't know exactly how it works. And so I would just caution people, whatever you think you know about the model, you might be 100% correct, but you might not. And there might be things you know and things you don't know. And it just behooves you to at least become fully informed. And at the end of the day, it might not be for you. I'm a big believer in saying, you maybe heard me say this before, that the RMO is not for everyone. I'm not some cheerleader here that just puts rose-colored glasses on and thinks that's the only thing. It is for, I'd say, most advisors, but it's not for everyone. But even the ones that it's a good fit for, that doesn't mean advisors would necessarily ever make the move. But you don't know that unless you become fully informed of exactly how it works. Then you can kind of draw conclusions about it.
Okay. Can you give me an example that you remember where it was an advisor and this was not the right move for him or her, and they just needed to stay where they were?
Yeah, I mean, if you have your own RIA particularly, or if you're 1099 with an RIA, or even for that matter, like an independent broker-dealer, you are a business owner, right? You're not just and I'm not minimizing, but a practitioner. You're not just the financial advisor. You wear that hat, of course, and you're also a business owner and all the responsibilities that come with that. And I've come across many advisors over my time that are, and again, we'll pick on the wirehouse world, that are very satisfied with the work they get to do with clients. They've built this wonderful practice. They make a very nice living doing it. And they could look at it and say, wow, I could make some more money. And yes, there's maybe more flexibility and I would have more satisfaction, but I got a pretty good thing going on over here. And I realize it's not perfect. I realize maybe it could be better, but this is a pretty good thing. And I'm just going to sit tight, and I like just being the practitioner. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I'm actually a firm believer that the W-2 kind of, we'll call them broker dealer, but more and more the assets are on the fee-based side. I'm a firm believer that model will continue to lose advisors, but that has staying power. I think where it's trickier is for the independent broker dealers out there where those advisors are already demonstrated they're able and willing to be also a business owner. So they're already willing to take on those additional responsibilities, and they're seeing their own practices become more and more fee-based, and they're kind of questioning, is there a reason we just don't take that final step? And yes, there'll be a little more responsibility than we have now, but they've already done the heavy lifting to be independent to begin with.
Okay. Interesting. Do you have any, so you think, I was going to start talking about broker dealers, but we don't need to get into it. We could move on to the timeline. If I was exploring this, if somebody is starting, they just have the idea. We know there's a lot of research and things, but yeah, give us that timeline, number of months, and just what to expect over whatever period. How does it all play out?
Yep. So the average from the time someone's reaching out to me, and again, that's usually they've been thinking about this for a little bit. They've been probably maybe, doing a little research on their own. And so they're, say, already on the way to first base, to use the baseball analogy. From the time they're maybe talking to someone like me to the time they might actually be making the move, generally 6 to 9 months is a good measured pace to do that. I've certainly worked with advisors that measure it in years. Just earlier this morning, talking to one and trying to pencil in earlier, mid 2027. It's a little early to get too far into the weeds. Here we are, it's still in 2025, but there's certainly some folks that start mapping it out far in advance, and there's different reasons you might need it to be that far in advance. But on the other end of the spectrum, particularly if you're joining an RIA, you can't do that in 4 weeks if you wanted to. There's minimum time needed to establish an RIA from a regulatory standpoint and work through the steps. So even in that fire drill situation, in the rare instance it comes up, it is what it is. You can't just quickly make a change. Now, if you're joining an RIA, that can go a lot quicker, but even that, to do it arguably correctly and at a nice measured pace, they're still going to want months of time to work with you. They want to understand your practice, make sure they're going to be a good fit. They don't want to get the marriage started and then it not be a good fit. And likewise, you need to prepare on your side. So this is definitely measured in months, and most of them are in that 6 to 9 month, but definitely ones that for different reasons go longer.
Okay. So, let's pretend it's 6 months was the goal, and let's pretend that I was going own RIA. Can you break it down even further of like what amount of time is study and fact finding and creating the plan? What's the next chunk of time before? I mean, is the end of the 6 months the actual pull the trigger and then start the process, or is that getting factored into that 6 month window?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I should clarify. The 6 to 9 months is when you've done all your work, your due diligence, put everything in a plan in place, and you resign. Now that's just the start of the next chapter, right? You still need to actually transition the client. So yeah, to clarify, 6 to 9 months is to go from conversation to when you're launching, and then moving beyond that. Some of the things that are time commitments, typically the longest one that seems to delay things at times for folks that are not already independent is whatever their office situation is going to be. So some RAs are now fully virtual, so that obviously becomes a bit of a moot point. But if you are leaving a wirehouse world, W-2 world, and you're going to need or want to procure an office, depends on which path you go down. That process easily can take months and months and months. There's build out, there's usually delays with that. So that's usually what I talk to folks kind of early. Okay, hey, if we're mapping this out, what is the strategy there? Because that's typically going to take some time. And then just getting it registered as an example, again, the RIA registered, that typically I quote 45 to 90 days just to do that properly with a compliance consultant firm, and the time it's needed for the regulators to do their part. So even if someone wanted to call me and say, Brad, can we pull an all-nighter and teach me everything I need to know, and I'm going to spend the next 48 hours doing everything that needs to be done, there's still stuff that's out of your control, no matter how quickly you want to make that go.
Okay. Gotcha. That's helpful. What's your take on just the RIA landscape and some of these? It just seems like there's more and more roll-up firms out there and more consolidation in this space. Do you think that's going to continue, and there's going to be just, a few major it seems like in every industry, everywhere, there's there's 2,000 car companies, and then there's 3, talking about American car companies. There's 10 Big 10 teams, and now there's 18 or 19. They're like, it's all getting consolidated. What's your take on just the RIA landscape?
Yeah, I think it's a two-edged sword, right? So it's a wonderful thing, I think, how far the industry has evolved, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years, because there are so many different flavors. And by the way, we can't even easily define nowadays what is an aggregator firm or what is a roll-up firm, because you have different kinds of offerings all calling themselves that same thing. And so the good news is that there's so many different flavors out there to choose from. The bad news is, how do you piece through that? How do you know what's out there? How do you determine what's best for your practice? So I think it's on net, I think it's certainly healthy for the industry that you have all these options, but I think it does make it more complex trying to figure this out as well. And I think it's only going to continue to grow. There is the theory that there's going to be half a dozen so-called mega RIAs out there, national RIAs. The fact that we're seeing RIAs with hundreds of billions in assets, the numbers are getting quite big. But I'm also a firm believer that will never push out the so-called small guy. And depends on who you ask who the small guy is. Again, some quantify that under $1 billion in assets. That if you can carve out a good value proposition for your client, you're still going to be able to serve your market out there. You don't have to be part of something that's 200 billion in size. But to their credit, the firms that are that big are clearly doing something good for clients as well, because they're able to grow the firms to that point. So I think it's healthy, but I think it will become increasingly challenging to sort through all of it as well.
How about the specific topic of just custodian selection? How should we be thinking about that? What are 3 factors or any number of factors that we should consider on this is the right fit for us?
Yep. And so that's clearly one of the biggest decisions in this process. And I'll answer your question, but if you're starting your own RIA, you clearly need a custodian. If you manage assets, you generally always start with one, often referred to as your primary custodian. Most RIAs of size over time add more than one and become, as they say, multi-custodial. You typically never want to try to be multi-custodial from the jump, just because there's already enough moving parts in making a transition. And then if you're joining an RIA, part of their value prop is, hey, because of our bigger size, we've got 3 or 4 custodians already, and we have more size than you do, so we get better service from them, and you can use whichever of those you want to use. So there's kind of benefits to that as well. But it is a big decision, because it is highly unlikely, and let's say you start your own RIA and you hopefully do good due diligence and pick a custodian, it is highly unlikely that you will ever move assets from that custodian going forward. Now, you might add a custodian, like I said, and maybe all new clients get opened up over there. But just statistically speaking, you look at the industry, folks do not move assets unless there's a very pressing pain point, because to go to your clients and say, hey, nothing's changing with the firm here, we just would like to move you from one custodian to the other, that's a little bit of a harder sell, and just operationally. So it is a very big decision to have to make that on the front end. And to keep in mind, there's actually about a dozen players in the RIA custodial space. We typically only hear of or often the top of mind, the so-called big 3, which is Pershing, Fidelity, Schwab. It used to be thought of as the big 4, which TD was the 4th. Schwab bought TD. But you see some wonderful solutions as well. Altruist is making a lot of waves. LPL is going heavy into the space. And like I said, when you look at some of the smaller players too, there's about 12 of them. And so when you look at them all, as I say about a lot of things, they all have pros and cons. And so you just want to understand, and not to be self-serving. That's a big part of what I help advisors and teams do, is understand, okay, how are they different? What is the value prop of this one? Who does it appeal to? How do they typically price out their services? Some custodians have minimum asset sizes, or some, dependent on your size and advisor or team, are not even perhaps going to be available to you. So it's to know what's available to me. Why is this one different than this one? And that can get a little tricky, because arguably, call it 85% of what a custodian does is commoditized. One of them does not clear a trade better than another one. They all make statements for clients. One statement is not, meaningfully better than another one. So it just comes down to, is of the differentiators, what is going to be most meaningful for you and your particular team.
Okay. What haven't I asked? What's important that we should talk about that advisors need to know?
Good question. I would say, I often ask, sometimes our advisors come in, they're describing their practice. And sometimes I'll throw it back on them and say, why haven't you done this already? And so I don't want to downplay the amount of work that goes into this and the amount of due diligence. And by the way, advisors and teams, you still have your day job to continue doing day after day, while on top of that, for perhaps a year's of work, you're also trying to put all this in place. So I would just say to advisors, ask yourself, why are you perhaps not going down this path? Again, it might not be for you, but what's holding you back from at least learning about it? And if it makes sense, actually doing it. And you might have very good reasons not to do it, but I can't tell you the amount of times that folks just don't understand how some of these variables work. And I don't blame them, because if you've only been in one channel your whole life, you're not going to understand how it works over here. So if someone was only in the RIA channel their whole life, they're not going to know the intricacies of a wirehouse channel. I would add, I'm not aware of any advisor, to my knowledge, I'm sure it's maybe happened, but not that I'm aware of, that's ever, by the way, gone down the path of an RIA closed up shop and went to a wirehouse. So it's kind of telling in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
But just to challenge yourself, do I know enough to make a decision, or am I just going off of what I'm hearing from maybe my own firm of what I should or shouldn't be doing?
Okay. And there's a lot of good content. If you haven't seen Brad's channel, I'll link that below. You're talking about this all the time on the YouTube channel. So you could even start there and start to just gain more knowledge. And then when someone's ready, what's the process look like with you if they want to explore this more or just start asking questions? How does it look if someone contacts you?
Yeah, and I appreciate the kind words on the website. So just to throw a plug out there, transition2ria.com, as Dave pointed out. Very descriptive name. This is the only thing I do. I'm not a marketing guru. I'm not a practice management guru. I'm not an M&A. I don't help you sell your practice one day if that's your thing. It's one focus is to help you transition to the RA model. And I'm a big believer in putting out content, education, and saying, hey, take a look at all that, learn about the model, learn about me, and then would love to have that conversation. And so there's contact information on the website, but certainly encourage people to start by checking out the videos. I got 130 plus now. Just every episode is answering a specific question about the model. They're available in podcast form as well, if that's your preferred way to digest it. But start there, educate yourself, and if I can be a resource digging deeper, happy to do that.
Awesome. And then, yeah, it's easy to contact you. It'll be under the YouTube videos or the website. It's easy if you go that route. This has been great, Brad. Thanks for sharing some of your knowledge here.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on. And again, right before we jumped on, I knew you had a bunch, but you know the exact amount, but was it 380 maybe videos you put out there? So I appreciate all you do for the industry as well. And the more we can put out there, this is better it is for everyone. So thanks for letting me be part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Take care.
All right. Thanks.